When the heat breaks, the woman fell 3 feet from his porch. Caleb Hartman had seen desperation before. Men crawling toward water, animals dragging broken legs toward shade. But he had never seen a mother collapse with a child still clutched to her chest, still trying to shield that small body even as her own gave out. The Wyoming summer had no mercy. Dust rose where she hit the ground. The child didn't cry. That was worse. 11 years he'd kept this ranch closed to hope, to noise, to the possibility of caring again. Then a stranger arrived dying on his doorstep, and every wall he'd built began to crack. Welcome to a story of second chances born from summer heat and desperate courage. If this story moves you, please like this video and comment with your city so I can see how far Nora and Caleb's journey travels. Now let's begin where everything changed, on a day too hot for mercy, too desperate for pride. The heat came early that summer, and it came mean. By mid-June, the Wyoming plains were already baked hard as kiln-fired clay, the grass brittle beneath boot heels, the creek running shallow enough that a man could count the stones on the bottom without squinting. Caleb Hartman had seen 34 summers in this territory, and he couldn't recall a single one that had arrived with such vicious intent. The sun didn't warm, it punished. It pressed down on the land like a hand shoving something into submission, and everything beneath it either bent or broke. Caleb didn't bend easy. He rode into town that morning with a notice folded in his shirt pocket and a headache already forming behind his eyes. The road stretched before him in shimmering waves, heat rising off the dirt in visible currents that made the horizon waver and dance. His horse, a gray mare named Dust for obvious reasons, plodded forward with her ears flicked back, annoyed but resigned. She knew the routine. Town once a week, supplies loaded, silence maintained, home before dark. The notice in his pocket was simple. Cook wanted, room and board. Hartman Ranch, 8 miles west of town. Inquire at the Mercantile. His last cook had lasted 3 weeks before declaring the isolation unnatural for a Christian soul and fleeing back to her sister's boarding house in Cheyenne. Before her, there'd been an older man who'd stayed 2 months before his rheumatism drove him to lower altitudes. Before him, a young couple who'd taken one look at the empty house, the silent men, the way Caleb moved through his own home like a ghost occupying a space it no longer claimed, and they'd left the same day they arrived. Caleb didn't blame any of them. The ranch was isolated. 8 miles from town wasn't far by distance, but it was far enough that you felt it, the weight of all that open space. The way sound disappeared into the grass and sky without echo, the endless stretch of days where the only voices you heard were your own and the men who worked the cattle and fixed the fences and asked for nothing more than wages and silence. He'd built that silence himself, brick by careful brick, year after year. The Mercantile owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Halstead with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, took the notice without comment. She pinned it to the board near the door between an advertisement for a traveling dentist and a reward poster for a horse thief. "You might have better luck if you offered more than room and board," she said, not unkindly. Caleb touched the brim of his hat. "It's what's available." "Most folks want wages, Mr. Hartman. Most folks don't want to live 8 miles from the nearest conversation." Mrs. N. Halstead's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "That's the truth of it, I suppose." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening in a way that made him want to leave immediately. "You know, it's been 11 years now. No one would think poorly of you for— I appreciate you posting the notice, ma'am." Caleb tipped his hat again and walked out before she could finish the sentence. He knew what people thought. Hell, he thought it himself most days. 11 years was a long time to live in a house built for a family when you were the only one left in it. Long enough that the silence had soaked into the walls, into the floors, into the very air until it became the defining characteristic of the place. The Hartman Ranch wasn't known for its cattle anymore, though the herd was respectable. It wasn't known for the quality of its horses, though Caleb bred some of the steadiest mounts in the territory. It was known as the place where Caleb Hartman lived alone and preferred it that way. He loaded his supplies, flour, coffee, sugar, salt, dried beans, and secured them in the saddlebags. The sun was directly overhead now, brutal and unrelenting. Sweat soaked through his shirt, plastering it to his back, He'd forgotten his canteen, left it on the kitchen table that morning in his distraction, and the thought of the 8-mile ride home without water made his throat dry just considering it. Stupid. Careless. He was getting sloppy, letting routine slip. He swung into the saddle and turned dust toward home. The mare seemed as eager as he was to leave town behind, to return to the familiar isolation where expectations were few and conversations fewer. They'd covered maybe half a mile when Caleb saw the figure on the road ahead. At first, he thought it was a trick of the heat, those wavering mirages that made you see water where there was none, trees where the land was flat and bare. But as dust plodded closer, the figure remained solid. A person, walking. Stumbling, really, with an uneven gait that spoke of exhaustion or injury or both. Caleb's first instinct was to ride past. It wasn't cruelty, just practicality. People walk these roads all the time, drifters, travelers, folks down on their luck looking for work or charity, or both. He'd learned long ago that stopping for every stranger was a good way to lose time, money, or worse. The world was full of people with hard stories and empty pockets, and Caleb Hartman wasn't running a charity. But something made him slow dust to a walk as they approached. Maybe it was the way the figure moved, not the confident stride of someone choosing to walk, but the desperate lurch of someone who had no choice left. Maybe it was the size. Too small for a man, too burdened for a child. Maybe it was just that the heat had made him stupid, made him forget all the reasons he'd spent 11 years keeping the world at arm's length. Whatever it was, he slowed. And then he saw. A woman. Young, though the sun and dust made it hard to tell exactly how young. Her dress was pale blue, or had been once. Now it was gray with road dust, torn at the hem, soaked with sweat at the back and underarms. Her hair, dark and matted, hung loose around her shoulders. She carried something clutched to her chest, wrapped in what looked like a shawl or blanket. A child. Caleb's stomach tightened. The woman didn't seem to notice him, didn't turn or acknowledge the sound of hoofbeats on the road behind her. She just kept walking, each step a visible effort, her shoulders hunched forward as if bracing against a wind that wasn't there. He was close enough now to see that she was barefoot. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by the dry air and disuse. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Caleb guided dust alongside her, keeping pace. "Ma'am, you need help?" Nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, unfocused and glazed. The bundle in her arms shifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of a small face, flushed red with heat, eyes closed, his chest constricted. "Ma'am, you're going to collapse if you keep—" She stopped walking. For a moment she just stood there, swaying slightly, her breathing audible even over the creak of saddle leather and the soft blow of dust's breath. Then her knees buckled. Caleb was off his horse before conscious thought kicked in. He caught her before she hit the ground, his hands closing around her arms, and the heat radiating from her skin shocked him. She was burning up, fever-hot, trembling with exhaustion or illness or both. The child, a little girl, maybe 2 years old, whimpered softly, but didn't wake. "I've got you," Caleb heard himself say, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, the woman, the child, or himself. "I've got you both." The woman's eyes fluttered open, and for just a moment she looked directly at him. Her eyes were gray, the color of smoke or storm clouds, wide with fear and something else, something that looked like apology. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in his arms. Caleb didn't remember making the decision to take her home. Later, when he had time to think about it, to question his own judgment, he'd realized that there hadn't been a decision to make. You didn't leave a woman and child dying on the road. You didn't weigh options or consider consequences. You did what needed doing, and you sorted out the implications afterward. But in that moment, standing on a dusty road with an unconscious stranger in his arms and a feverish child whimpering against his chest, there was no thought at all, just movement. He got the woman onto Dust's back, no easy feat given her dead weight, and the mare's understandable nervousness at the strange burden. He climbed up behind her, settling her against his chest, the child still clutched in her arms. The woman's head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the heat of her fever through both their clothes. The 8 miles home had never felt longer. Dust moved carefully, sensing the fragility of her passengers, and Caleb kept one arm wrapped around the woman's waist, holding her steady. The child had stopped whimpering, which worried him more than the crying had. Too quiet, too still. Her small face was flushed scarlet, her breathing rapid and shallow. He didn't let himself think about what would happen if he got them home and they didn't wake up. Didn't let himself consider the implications of bringing strangers onto his property, into his house, strangers who might be running from something, who might bring trouble to his door. He just kept Dust moving forward, kept his arm secure around the woman's waist, and watched the horizon for the first glimpse of home. When the ranch buildings finally came into view, the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse where his 3 ranch hands lived, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly. He wouldn't feel that until he knew they were going to be all right, but something close to it. 2 of his men, Jack and Tom, were working near the corral. They looked up as Caleb rode in, their expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm as they registered what he was carrying. "Boss?" Jack, the younger of the 2, started forward. "What happened?" "Found her on the road." Caleb didn't slow Dust until they reached the porch. "She collapsed. Child sick. Need you to fetch Doc Miller from town." Jack was already moving toward the barn to saddle a fresh horse. Tom, older and steadier, stepped up to take Dust's reins. "I'll see to the mare," Tom said quietly. "You get them inside." Caleb dismounted carefully, mindful of his burden. The woman hadn't stirred once during the ride, and the child's stillness was starting to terrify him. He carried them both up the porch steps he'd built himself 15 years ago, wood weathered gray now, but still solid, and shouldered open the front door. The house was dim and blessedly cool after the brutal sun outside. He'd kept the curtains drawn against the heat, and the main room was shadowed and silent. It had been silent for 11 years. He carried the woman straight through to the bedroom that had been his and Sarah's, the room he hadn't slept in since the day she died. He used the smaller room off the kitchen now, barely more than a closet, but this room had the good bed, the window that caught the cross breeze, the space for 2 people instead of 1. He laid the woman down as gently as he could, easing the child from her arms and placing the little girl beside her mother. They looked like ghosts in the dim light, pale and still, barely breathing. Caleb stood there for a moment, his hands still outstretched, suddenly aware that he had no idea what he was doing. It had been 11 years since he'd cared for anyone. 11 years since he'd needed to think about fevers and cooling cloths and whether someone was going to make it through the night. He'd forgotten how terrifying it was, this business of keeping people alive, but his body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. He moved to the washstand, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, grabbed clean cloths from the cupboard. He soaked one cloth and pressed it to the woman's forehead, another to the child's. Their skin was so hot it felt like the fever might burn straight through them. The woman stirred slightly at the touch of cool water, a small sound escaping her throat, not quite a word, just a syllable of distress or relief. The child didn't move at all. "Come on," Caleb heard himself murmur, his voice strange in the quiet room. "Come on, don't give up now. You made it this far." He didn't know if he was talking to them or to himself. He kept the cloths cool, changing them out when they grew warm, bathing their faces and necks and wrists, trying to bring the fevers down. Time became slippery. He didn't know if he'd been working for minutes or hours when he heard hoofbeats outside, voices calling. Doc Miller burst into the room with the efficiency of a man who'd seen too many emergencies to waste time on pleasantries. He was in his 60s, gray-bearded and sharp-eyed, and he took one look at the 2 still forms on the bed and started barking orders. "Caleb, I need more water, cold as you can get it, and clean sheets. We need to get them out of these clothes." Caleb moved automatically, grateful to have instructions to follow, tasks to complete that didn't require him to think about what it meant if the doctor's efforts failed. He brought water, brought sheets, brought the whiskey from the cupboard when Doc Miller called for it. Jack hovered in the doorway, his young face anxious. "Boss? Anything I can do?" "Stay close," Caleb said. "Case we need you to ride back to town." For what, he didn't say. They all knew. Doc Miller worked with quiet competence, examining both patients, listening to their breathing, checking their pulses. He stripped the child down to her underclothes and bathed her entire body with cool water, then did the same for the woman, with Caleb turning his back to give what privacy he could. Heat stroke, the doctor announced after what felt like hours. Both of them. The woman's also got exhaustion, dehydration, looks like she hasn't eaten properly in days. The child's worse. She's small, and children don't regulate heat as well. They were damned lucky you found them when you did. Another hour in that sun. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Will they make it? Caleb's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. He gripped the bedpost to hide the tremor. If the fevers break, yes. If they don't, Doc Miller met his eyes, and Caleb saw the honest uncertainty there. We wait. We keep them cool. We get water in them when they wake enough to swallow. And we wait. Waiting. Caleb had spent 11 years waiting. Waiting for the pain to fade. Waiting for the silence to feel like peace instead of punishment. Waiting for a reason to care about something beyond the daily routines that kept him breathing but not quite living. Now he was waiting again, but this time for something he couldn't name. For two strangers who'd collapsed on his doorstep. For a woman whose name he didn't know, and a child whose mother might not wake to hold her again. He sent Doc Miller home with payment and a promise to call if anything changed. He sent Jack and Tom back to their work, though Tom offered to sit up with him. I'll manage, Caleb said, and Tom nodded, understanding that some vigils a man needed to keep alone. So he sat. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat in the gathering darkness, changing the cooling cloths, dripping water onto their lips when they stirred, watching the shallow rise and fall of their breathing. The child whimpered occasionally in her sleep, small sounds of distress that made Caleb's chest ache. The woman was quieter, her face turned toward her daughter even in unconsciousness, her hand reaching toward the small body beside her. Caleb remembered that instinct, that desperate need to keep your child close, to know they were safe. He'd felt it once, briefly, before the fever that took Sarah and their unborn son ripped that future away from him. 11 years ago. He'd been 23 and stupid with hope, sure that the worst thing that could happen was a hard winter or a failed crop. He'd had no idea that loss could be so absolute, so permanent, so utterly devastating that it changed the entire shape of your life. He'd learned. The night deepened. Through the window, he could see stars emerging, brilliant and cold, and utterly indifferent to the small dramas of suffering playing out beneath them. The house was silent except for the quiet breathing from the bed and the occasional creak of Caleb's chair when he shifted his weight. It was near midnight when the woman's eyes opened. She didn't wake gradually. One moment she was unconscious, the next her eyes snapped open, wide and panicked, her body jerking as if to run. Caleb leaned forward, his hands raised in what he hoped was a calming gesture. Easy, he said softly. You're safe. You're at my ranch. You collapsed on the road. I brought you here. She stared at him, her eyes moving rapidly across his face as if cataloging details, searching for threat or deception. Then her gaze snapped to the child beside her, and a sound escaped her throat, relief and fear mixed together. Poppy, she whispered, her hand reaching for her daughter. She's alive, Caleb said quickly. Fever's still high, but the doc says if we can keep it from spiking, she'll be all right. You both will. The woman's hand found her daughter's, gripping tight. How long? Since you collapsed? Maybe 8 hours. It's just past midnight now. She closed her eyes, and Caleb saw tears slip from beneath her lids, tracking down her temples into her hair. I thought we wouldn't make it. You almost didn't. Caleb kept his voice gentle but honest. Another hour in that sun, the doc said, I know. She opened her eyes again, and this time when she looked at him, he saw something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Gratitude. Thank you for stopping, for bringing us here. Most men would have done the same. No. Her voice was firm despite its weakness. They wouldn't. Caleb didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd surprised himself today by being someone he didn't quite recognize anymore. Someone who stopped for strangers, who opened his home, who sat vigil through the night for people whose names he didn't even know. I'm Caleb, he said. Caleb Hartman. This is my ranch. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the strange sense that she was deciding something, weighing risks he couldn't see. Finally, she spoke. "Nora," she said quietly. "Nora Wren. And that's my daughter, Poppy." "Nora." He said it carefully, testing the shape of it. "Where were you headed? Town's 8 miles back the other way." Something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "Anywhere," she said. "Just anywhere that wasn't where we were." It was an answer and not an answer, and Caleb recognized the evasion for what it was. She was running. The question was from what? Or from whom? "Are you in trouble?" he asked bluntly. Nora's jaw tightened. "I don't want to bring trouble to you. We'll leave as soon as Poppy can travel. I won't—" "That's not what I asked." Their eyes met, and in hers he saw the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with walking too far in too much heat. It was deeper than that, older than that. It was the exhaustion of someone who'd been running for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. He recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror for 11 years. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm in trouble. We're in trouble. And anyone who helps us will be too." Caleb should have told her to leave, should have said that as soon as she could walk, she needed to be gone, taking her trouble and her desperation and her gray storm cloud eyes somewhere far away from his ranch, his silence, his carefully constructed solitude. Instead, he heard himself say, "Tell me." Nora's eyes widened. "You don't want to know. You don't want to. If trouble's coming to my door, I want to know what it looks like." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "And if you're going to be under my roof, even for a night, I want to know who might come looking for you." She was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. Then Poppy stirred beside her, whimpering, and Nora's resolve seemed to crumble. "There's a man," she said, her voice flat and weary. "Gideon Crow. He owns boarding houses in 3 territories. I worked in one of them, in Montana. Cooking, cleaning, whatever was needed. I was widowed, needed the work, and he offered good wages." She paused, swallowing hard. What he didn't mention was that the wages came with expectations. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd heard this story before, or versions of it. Men with money and power who thought both could buy them anything they wanted, including women who had no choice but to accept. "I refused him," Nora continued, "multiple times. He didn't take it well. Started saying I owed him money, room and board I'd supposedly taken beyond my wages, supplies I'd supposedly stolen. All lies. But he had account books that backed up every word, and I had nothing but my own testimony." Her hand tightened on Poppy's. "He said if I didn't comply, he'd have me arrested for theft. Or he'd take Poppy to pay the debt, put her in an orphanage, or sell her to a family that could use cheap labor." The rage that flooded through Caleb was sudden and fierce, shocking in its intensity. He hadn't felt anything this sharp in 11 years, and the force of it nearly made him stand up, pace, break something. Instead, he forced his voice to remain calm. "So you ran." 3 weeks ago, I took Poppy and what little money I'd managed to hide and ran. I thought if I could get far enough, fast enough." She trailed off, her expression hopeless. "But he has men looking. I've had to avoid towns, avoid main roads. We ran out of money 6 days ago. Food 3 days ago. I thought if I could just get somewhere, anywhere, I could find work, start over. But Poppy got sick from the heat, and I—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Caleb sat with this information, turning it over in his mind. A powerful man with resources and connections, tracking a woman who dared to say no. Men searching for her across territories. The kind of trouble that didn't give up just because you crossed a border or changed your name. The smart thing would be to send her on her way, give her some supplies, maybe a little money, point her toward the next town, and wish her luck. Keep his ranch, his life, his carefully maintained isolation separate from other people's problems. The smart thing. But when had he ever been smart about things that mattered? "You'll stay," he said. Nora's eyes snapped to his face. "What?" "You'll stay, both of you, until Poppy's well, at minimum. After that—" He paused, thinking it through even as he spoke. "After that, you can decide. But you need rest, food, safety. I can offer all 3. You don't understand. If he finds us here, if he finds out you helped us, let me worry about that. Mr. Hartman, Caleb." She blinked, thrown by the correction. Caleb, I can't ask you to... You're not asking, I'm offering. He met her eyes, his expression serious. I need a cook. My last one quit 3 weeks ago. Room and board in exchange for work. When Poppy's well, you can help in the kitchen, around the house. It's a legitimate job, not charity. If anyone asks, that's what you tell them. Why? The word was barely a whisper. Why would you do this for strangers? Caleb didn't have a good answer for that. Didn't know how to explain that in the moment he'd seen her collapse, seen her still trying to shield her daughter even as her own body failed. Something in him had shifted. Some part of him that had been frozen for 11 years had cracked, and he wasn't sure he could freeze it again even if he wanted to. Because you need help, he said simply, and I can give it. That's enough. Nora's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they spilled over, running down her face unchecked. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay. Say you'll let yourself rest. Caleb stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room, the rawness of it. Say you'll let me help. She nodded, unable to speak. Good. He moved toward the door, then paused. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry, water in the pitcher. If Poppy's fever spikes or you need anything, call out. I'll be in the next room. Caleb? He turned back. Thank you, Nora said, her voice steady despite the tears. For stopping, for bringing us here, for not asking us to leave. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and left the room. In the kitchen, in the darkness, he braced his hands against the counter and let himself shake. Let himself feel the fear he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge while Doc Miller worked, while Nora slept, while he'd sat vigil waiting to see if they would wake. They were alive. Both of them. Against odds that should have killed them, they were alive. And he'd just invited them to stay. He'd opened his home, the home he'd kept closed and silent for 11 years, to a woman running from a powerful man and a child who might bring nothing but trouble to his door. It was reckless. It was stupid. It was the opposite of everything he'd built his life around since Sarah died. It was also, he realized with something like shock, the first time in 11 years he'd felt something besides the dull ache of existing. Outside, the summer night pressed close and hot against the windows. Inside, in the room that had been silent for so long, he could hear the soft murmur of a mother's voice singing quietly to her child. Caleb closed his eyes and listened. The silence was breaking. He wasn't sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. Maybe both. Morning came too bright and too hot, the sun already brutal by the time Caleb stepped out onto the porch. He'd slept badly, startling awake at every sound from the bedroom, listening for changes in breathing, for cries of distress, for the silence that would mean the worst. But both Nora and Poppy had made it through the night. When he'd checked on them just after dawn, Poppy's fever had broken, her small face peaceful in sleep, her mother's arm curled protectively around her. Nora had been awake, watching him from the bed, her gray eyes wary but grateful. How is she? Caleb had asked quietly. Better, breathing easier, the fever's down. Good, that's good. He'd stood there awkwardly, unsure of the protocol for this situation. There's coffee in the kitchen, food if you're hungry, I'll be outside if you need anything. And he'd fled like a coward, out into the familiar territory of ranch work and morning routines. Now he stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching his men move through their tasks. Tom was checking fence lines in the north pasture. Jack was working with a green colt in the corral, patient and steady. Eli, the oldest of his hands, was repairing a broken wagon wheel in the barn. Normal, ordinary. The same task they'd done yesterday and would do tomorrow. Except everything had changed. There were strangers in his house, in his bedroom, in the spaces he'd kept sacred and separate from the world for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to share them. And he'd promised them safety, had offered them a job, a place to stay, protection against whoever was hunting them. What the hell had he been thinking? Boss? Caleb turned to find Tom approaching, his weathered face concerned. Everything all right? Jack said you brought in a woman and child last night. Found them on the road? News traveled fast, even on an isolated ranch. Yeah, they collapsed from the heat. Heat stroke. Doc Miller came out, said they'd be all right with rest. Tom nodded slowly. They family of yours? No, strangers, but... Caleb paused, choosing his words carefully. I offered her a job, cook and housekeeper, room and board, once she's back on her feet. Tom's expression didn't change, but Caleb saw the surprise in his eyes. In the 7 years Tom had worked at the Hartman Ranch, Caleb had never brought anyone onto the property who wasn't absolutely necessary. No extra hands, no temporary help, no visitors who stayed longer than a polite hour. That right? Tom said mildly. Well, we could use a decent cook. That last one couldn't make coffee without burning it. It was such a careful non-reaction that Caleb almost smiled despite himself. Tom was a good man, steady, loyal, and smart enough to know when not to ask questions. She's running from trouble, Caleb heard himself say, and then wondered why he was volunteering information he hadn't planned to share. Man named Gideon Crow, you heard of him? Tom's expression darkened. Can't say I have, but the name sounds like money. Money usually comes with power. That's what I figure. And if he comes looking? Caleb met Tom's eyes directly. Then he'll find a woman working a legitimate job on my property, and he can take his grievances to the law if he has them. Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. All right then, you need us, you call. Appreciate it. Tom turned to go, then paused. It's good, he said quietly, not looking at Caleb. Having life in the house again. Been too quiet too long. Before Caleb could respond, Tom was walking away, heading back toward the north pasture with his easy rolling gait. Caleb stood there, coffee cooling in his hand, and tried to figure out when his carefully ordered life had spun so completely out of his control. The answer came from behind him, a small voice, tentative and young. Mister? He turned. A little girl stood in the doorway, Poppy, though he'd only seen her unconscious and feverish before. She was tiny, maybe 2.5, with dark curls that framed a heart-shaped face and enormous eyes the same gray as her mother's. She wore a nightgown that was far too large for her, clearly borrowed from something of Nora's, and she clutched a ragged cloth doll to her chest. She looked at him with solemn wariness, a child who'd learned too young to be careful of strangers. Hey there, Caleb said, keeping his voice gentle. You feeling better? Poppy nodded slowly. Mama said I was sick, but I'm better now. That's good, real good. Caleb crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. Your mama inside? She's sleeping. She said I could look outside if I was quiet. Poppy took a small step onto the porch, her bare feet soundless on the weathered boards. Is this your house? It is. It's big. I suppose it is. We used to have a little house, before. Poppy's expression grew sad. I miss it. Caleb didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to comfort a child mourning a home she'd been forced to leave. He'd never been good with children, even before. After Sarah, he'd avoided them entirely, couldn't stand the reminder of what he'd lost. But something about this small, solemn girl made him want to try. You like horses? He asked. Poppy's eyes widened. Are there horses here? Lots of them. You want to see? She nodded eagerly, her wariness momentarily forgotten. Caleb stood and offered his hand. Poppy looked at it for a moment, considering, then slipped her small hand into his. Her fingers were warm and delicate, her grip surprisingly strong. They walked together to the corral, where Jack was still working with the colt. The young horse was skittish, dancing sideways when Jack approached, but Jack was patient, speaking in low, soothing tones, letting the colt come to him. Poppy pressed against the fence, fascinated. He's scared, she whispered. Yeah, Caleb agreed. But Jack's good with scared animals. He'll help him learn there's nothing to fear. They watched in silence for a while, and Caleb found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. There was something peaceful about standing here with this small person, watching the patient dance of man and horse, the morning sun warming the earth, the sounds of the ranch familiar and comforting. Mr. Hartman? Nora's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the peace. Caleb turned to see her rushing toward them, still in her nightgown and borrowed robe, her face pale. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. She was just right there a moment ago, and then... She reached them, breathless, and pulled Poppy away from Caleb as if he might have been threatening her daughter. I'm so sorry. I told her to stay inside. We should go back inside. There's breakfast in the kitchen. Help yourself to whatever you find. I'll be out here if you need anything. Nora nodded again. Already turning away, Poppy held close. Caleb watched them go, saw the way Nora kept glancing back over her shoulder, checking for threats, for danger, for the trouble she was sure would find them. He hoped she was wrong. But hope, he'd learned 11 years ago, was a dangerous thing to carry. Still, as he turned back to his work, to the familiar routines that had sustained him through years of deliberate emptiness, he couldn't quite let it go. Maybe this time, hope wouldn't break him. Maybe this time, it would be enough. The days that followed developed a rhythm that surprised Caleb with its ease. Nora stayed mostly inside at first, keeping Poppy close, venturing out only when necessary, and always with the watchful tension of someone expecting trouble. But she didn't sit idle. By the second morning, Caleb came in from early chores to find the kitchen scrubbed clean, coffee already brewed and strong, and the smell of biscuits filling the house for the first time in 11 years. He stood in the doorway, arrested by the simple domesticity of it. A woman at his stove, a child playing quietly on a blanket in the corner, morning light streaming through windows that had been dark for so long he'd forgotten how the sun looked coming through them. Nora glanced up from the pan she was tending, her expression uncertain. I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, and I thought, you've been so kind, I should at least earn my keep. You're supposed to be resting. I've rested enough. She turned back to the stove, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Besides, staying busy helps, keeps my mind from other things. Caleb understood that better than she probably realized. He'd spent 11 years staying busy, filling every hour with work, so he wouldn't have time to think, to remember, to feel the weight of everything he'd lost. Well, he said finally, moving toward the coffee pot, if you're going to cook, least I can do is tell you these are the best biscuits I've had in a decade. He hadn't meant it as high praise. Most of the cooking he'd endured in those years had been barely edible. But Nora's face brightened slightly, some of the wariness easing from her eyes. Thank you, she said quietly. That means something. They fell into an awkward silence, Caleb drinking his coffee, Nora tending the stove, both of them carefully not acknowledging how strange this was. Strangers sharing a kitchen, sharing space, trying to find the boundaries of this arrangement they'd stumbled into. Poppy broke the quiet, her voice cheerful and unconcerned with adult awkwardness. Mama, can I go see the horses again? Nora's expression tightened immediately. Not right now, sweetheart. But Mr. Caleb said, I said not right now, Poppy. The sharpness in Nora's tone made the little girl's face crumple. Caleb set down his coffee cup. Actually, I could use some help in the barn this morning. Got a new litter of kittens that need checking on. Could use someone small enough to count them all without scaring the mama cat. Poppy's eyes went wide. Kittens? 5 of them, last I looked. But they're squirmy little things. Might be 6 by now. He glanced at Nora, reading the conflict in her face. Only if your mama says it's all right, though. And only if you promise to stay right where I can see you. Nora looked between her daughter's hopeful face and Caleb's careful neutrality. He could see her weighing it, the risk of letting Poppy out of her sight against the impossibility of keeping a 2-year-old confined in a house indefinitely. Please, Mama, Poppy whispered. Nora's resistance crumbled. All right, but you listen to Mr. Hartman. You hear me? You do exactly what he says, and you don't wander off. Not even for a second. Poppy nodded solemnly, already scrambling to her feet. And Poppy? Nora crouched down, taking her daughter's small face in her hands. If anyone comes, anyone you don't know, you run straight back to me, fast as you can. Promise? I promise, Mama. Nora pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, then straightened, her eyes meeting Caleb's. In them, he saw a plea and a warning in equal measure. Keep her safe. Don't make me regret this trust. He nodded once, understanding. The barn was cool and dim after the harsh sunlight outside, smelling of hay and horse and the dusty sweetness of grain. Poppy's hand stayed tucked in Caleb's as they walked, her head swiveling to take in everything, the stalls with their occupants, the tack hanging on the walls, the swallows nesting in the rafters. It's like a castle, she breathed. Caleb had never thought of his barn as particularly impressive, but seeing it through her eyes, he supposed it was substantial. Large enough for a dozen horses, with a hayloft above and a tack room off to one side. Castle might be stretching it, he said, but it keeps the horses dry and the hay stored, so it does its job. He led her to the far corner, where a pile of old blankets marked the mama cat's chosen nesting spot. The cat, a scrappy orange tabby who'd wandered onto the property 2 years ago and decided to stay, watched their approach with wary green eyes. Now, you've got to move real slow, Caleb instructed quietly. Mama cats are protective. You wouldn't want someone rushing up to you and Poppy, would you? Poppy shook her head seriously. Same with her. So we're going to sit down right here, nice and easy, and let her see we're not a threat. Then maybe she'll let us have a look at her babies. They settled onto the barn floor, Caleb's knees protesting the position, but willing to endure it for the look of wonder on Poppy's face as the kittens mewled and squirmed against their mother's belly. They're so small, Poppy whispered. Brand new, maybe a week old. Eyes aren't even open yet. Can I touch one? Let's ask Mama first. Caleb extended his hand slowly, letting the cat sniff his fingers. She tolerated it with the air of someone granting a favor, then began to purr. All right, I think that's a yes. But just one finger, real gentle. Poppy reached out with exaggerated care, her small finger brushing the smallest kitten's head. Her face split into a grin of pure delight. It's so soft. Like velvet, isn't it? They sat there for a while, Poppy entranced, Caleb content to let her wonder fill the silence. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to simply sit, to be present in a moment without the weight of grief or the pressure of work demanding his attention. Mr. Caleb? Poppy's voice was small, hesitant. Yeah? Are you going to make us leave? The question hit him harder than he'd expected. He looked down at this tiny girl, at the worry creasing her small forehead, at the way she was already bracing for disappointment, for loss, for the next terrible thing. She was 2 years old, and she already knew the world could be cruel. No, he said firmly. No, Poppy. I'm not going to make you leave. Mama says we can't stay anywhere long. She says the bad man will find us. Caleb's jaw tightened. Your mama's trying to keep you safe. That's her job. But my job is to make sure this ranch is a safe place. So as long as you're here, nobody's going to hurt you or your mama. I promise. Poppy looked up at him with those solemn gray eyes. Cross your heart? Cross my heart. She seemed to consider this, then nodded, satisfied. Okay, I believe you. Such simple faith, such dangerous trust. Caleb hoped to hell he could keep that promise. They stayed in the barn until Poppy started to tire, her questions coming slower, her body leaning more heavily against his side. He carried her back to the house. She fell asleep on his shoulder halfway there, and found Nora waiting on the porch, her anxiety palpable. She's fine, Caleb said before Nora could ask. Just tuckered herself out talking to kittens. Nora's shoulders sagged with relief as she reached for her daughter. Thank you for watching her, for... She trailed off, swallowing hard. For being patient with her. With us. Nothing to thank me for. There's everything to thank you for. Nora's eyes were bright with emotion she was clearly trying to control. You could have ridden past us on that road. Most people would have. But you stopped. You brought us here. You're giving us a chance to breathe, to rest, to... Her voice cracked. I haven't felt safe in 3 weeks. Not for a single moment. But here, today, watching you with Poppy, I felt almost safe. Almost. The qualifier hung between them, a reminder that her fear was still there, still justified, still waiting. You're safe here, Caleb said, and meant it. Whatever's coming, we'll handle it when it arrives. But for now, you're safe. Nora nodded, not quite believing but wanting to, and that seemed like progress. The days unfolded with increasing ease after that. Nora took over the kitchen completely, transforming the meals from barely tolerable to something the men actually looked forward to. She baked bread that filled the house with warmth and scent, made stews that had Jack asking for thirds, created breakfast that had Tom lingering over his coffee longer than strictly necessary. But it was more than the food. It was the way the house changed around her presence. She opened windows to let in fresh air, hung herbs to dry in the kitchen, put wildflowers in jars on the table. Small touches? Nothing dramatic, but they accumulated into something that felt dangerously close to home. Caleb noticed. Tried not to notice. Failed completely. He noticed the way Nora hummed while she worked, old songs he didn't recognize, melodies that seemed to ease the tension from her shoulders. He noticed how she'd started to relax slightly, to move through the house with less wariness, though she still jumped at unexpected sounds and kept Poppy always within sight. He noticed that the silence he'd built so carefully was disappearing, replaced by the sound of a child's laughter, a woman's voice, the ordinary noises of life being lived. It should have bothered him. For 11 years he'd protected that silence like a fortress. It was all he had left of Sarah, of the life they should have had, the quiet where her voice should have been, the emptiness where their child should have played. But Nora's presence wasn't erasing Sarah's memory. It was just making space for something else, something he'd thought he'd never want or need again. It terrified him. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The summer heat continued its relentless assault, but inside the ranch house, life settled into patterns that felt almost normal. Nora cooked and cleaned and gradually stopped looking over her shoulder every 5 minutes. Poppy befriended the barn cats and the ranch hands and the old dog that slept on the porch. The men treated Nora with careful respect and Poppy with gentle affection, and nobody asked questions about where they'd come from or why they'd stayed. Caleb told himself it was temporary, told himself he was just helping someone who needed it, told himself that when the time came for them to leave, he'd go back to his silence, his solitude, his carefully controlled existence. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. The first crack in their fragile peace came on a Tuesday morning, 3.5 weeks after Nora and Poppy had arrived. Caleb was working on the water pump behind the house when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead, and saw Jack riding in hard, his face flushed and worried. "Boss, got a visitor coming. Fancy-looking fellow, riding a black gelding worth more than my year's wages. Asked me where the main house was." Caleb's stomach tightened. "He give a name?" "No, sir, but he had that look, like money and meanness mixed together." "Get Tom and Eli, quiet-like. Don't alarm anyone, but I want you 3 close by." Jack nodded and rode off without question. "Good man." Caleb wiped his hands on his pants and walked around to the front of the house, arriving just as a rider crested the rise. Jack's description had been accurate. The horse was magnificent, the man astride it polished in a way that spoke of significant wealth. He wore a fine coat despite the heat, a silver-banded hat, boots that had probably cost more than Caleb's entire wardrobe. The man's face was handsome in a cold way, all sharp angles and assessing eyes. He smiled as he approached, but it didn't reach those eyes. "Good morning," the stranger called out, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm looking for the proprietor of this establishment. Would that be you?" "It would." Caleb kept his tone neutral. "Caleb Hartman. What can I do for you?" The man dismounted with practiced grace, tying his horse to the porch rail. "A pleasure, Mr. Hartman. My name is Gideon Crow. I'm a businessman from Montana Territory, and I'm afraid I'm on rather unfortunate business. I'm searching for a woman who fled my employ 3 weeks ago, a Mrs. Nora Wren, traveling with a small child. I don't suppose you've seen anyone matching that description?" The name hit Caleb like a fist to the gut, but he kept his expression carefully blank. Behind him, he heard the kitchen door open slightly, then close again. Nora had heard. She knew. "I've seen a lot of travelers on this road," Caleb said carefully. "Can't say I remember every face." Crow's smile widened, but his eyes went colder. "Of course, it's a busy thoroughfare, I'm sure, but Mrs. Wren is rather distinctive. Dark hair, gray eyes, quite pretty despite her current circumstances. And the child, a little girl named Poppy, perhaps 2 years old. They would have been traveling on foot, likely in some distress." Every word was carefully chosen, designed to convey ownership, possession, the right to track down what he considered his property. "Crow, I appreciate you riding all this way to share your concerns, but like I said, I see a lot of travelers on this road. Can't help you with information I don't have." Crow's pleasant expression cracked slightly. "Perhaps if I could speak with your household staff. Sometimes servants notice things their employers miss." "Don't have household staff, just ranch hands, and they're all out working. Besides, They wouldn't tell you anything different than I just did." They stared at each other, and Caleb could see Crow reassessing, calculating. The man hadn't gotten wealthy by being stupid, and he clearly sensed he wasn't getting the cooperation he'd expected. "Well," Crow said finally, his tone still pleasant but edged with steel, "I appreciate your time, Mr. Hartman. I'll be staying in town for the next few days, continuing my search. If you should happen to remember seeing Mrs. Wren, or if she should happen to pass by your property, I'd be most grateful for a message. There's a reward, of course, $50 for information leading to her recovery." "I'll keep that in mind." Crow mounted his horse with the same fluid grace, gathering the reins. He paused, looking down at Caleb with an expression that was no longer even pretending to be friendly. "A word of advice, Mr. Hartman. From one man of property to another. Women like Nora Wren are excellent liars. They spin tales of victimhood and persecution. They play on men's protective instincts, and they leave destruction in their wake. If you should encounter her, remember that everything she tells you is likely a fabrication designed to manipulate your sympathy." "I'll remember," Caleb said flatly. "You have a safe ride back to town, Mr. Crow." Crow's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and turned his horse, riding back the way he'd come at a controlled canter. Caleb waited until the man was out of sight before he let himself breathe properly. His hands were shaking with rage and adrenaline. The casual arrogance, the assumption of ownership, the barely veiled threat, all of it confirmed everything Nora had told him, and worse. The kitchen door opened, and Nora stepped out onto the porch. Her face was white, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles had gone bloodless. "He's here," she whispered. "He found us." "He suspects," Caleb corrected, moving toward her. "But he doesn't know, not for certain. He'll figure it out. He'll ask questions in town. He'll hear about the woman and child at the Hartman Ranch. He'll—" "Nora." Caleb took her shoulders gently, waiting until her panicked eyes focused on his face. "Listen to me. You work here. Legitimate employment. Room and board in exchange for cooking and housekeeping. That's not a crime. That's not hiding. That's just a job. You don't understand what he's capable of, the things he can do, the people he can buy. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, today, you haven't done anything wrong. You're not going to run again." "Caleb, you're not going to run," he repeated more firmly. "You're going to stay right here, where it's safe, where people are watching out for you. And if he comes back with the law, we'll handle it, together." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking so much for us?" It was a fair question, one Caleb had been asking himself for 3 weeks. He still didn't have a good answer, didn't know how to explain that her presence had cracked something open in him, let light into spaces that had been dark for so long he'd forgotten they existed. Didn't know how to say that Poppy's laughter had made him remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond simple survival. "Because it's right," he said finally, "and because I can. That's enough." Nora reached up and touched his face, her palm cool against his sun-heated skin. It was the first time she touched him voluntarily, and the contact sent electricity through his entire body. "Thank you," she whispered. Before he could respond, Poppy's voice called from inside. "Mama, I'm hungry." The moment broke. Nora pulled back, wiping her eyes quickly, forcing her expression into something calmer. I need to—" "Go," Caleb said gently. "Take care of your girl. I'll talk to the men, make sure everyone knows the story. You work here. That's all anyone needs to say." Nora nodded and slipped back inside, her composure fragile but holding. Caleb stood on the porch, watching the horizon where Crow had disappeared, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. He'd made promises. To Nora, to Poppy, to himself. He'd opened his home and offered protection. Now he had to figure out how to keep those promises against a man with money, power, and the law potentially on his side. The summer heat pressed down, relentless and unforgiving. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain that might not come. Caleb hoped the rain would come. They needed something to break this heat, this tension, this waiting for the other shoe to drop. But hope, he'd learned, was a dangerous thing. He went to find his men anyway. The conversation in the bunkhouse that evening was brief and direct. Caleb laid out the situation without embellishment. Nora was running from a man who claimed she owed him money. The man had shown up looking for her, and anyone who asked should be told she was the ranch cook and nothing more. Tom, Eli, and Jack listened without interruption. When Caleb finished, there was a long silence. Then Tom spoke, his voice gravelly and certain. "She seems like good people. The girl, too. If someone's hunting them, they got their reasons, and I doubt those reasons are the ones that fellow was selling." "I've known men like that," Eli added. He was older than the rest of them, had seen more of the world's ugliness. Rich men who think money means they own everything and everyone. Usually they're right, because most folks don't have the spine to stand against them. But that doesn't make it right. Jack nodded vigorously. "Poppy showed me a kitten yesterday, named it Butterscotch. Anyone who wants to hurt that kid is going to have to go through me first." Something in Caleb's chest loosened. He'd been carrying this alone, or thought he had, but he should have known better. Good men recognized injustice when they saw it, and they stood against it regardless of the cost. "Appreciate it," he said quietly. "All of you." "Nothing to appreciate," Tom said. "It's what's right. Now this Crow fellow, he seemed the type to make trouble?" "Without question." "Then we'll be ready for it." They dispersed after that back to their evening routines, but Caleb felt the shift. They weren't just employees anymore. They were allies, family almost. He walked back to the main house as the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if the day hadn't been so fraught with tension. Through the kitchen window, he could see Nora moving around, preparing dinner, Poppy at the table drawing pictures on scraps of paper. A normal scene, a domestic scene, the kind of scene he'd thought he'd never have again. He climbed the porch steps slowly, reluctant to disturb the moment, and that's when he heard it. Nora's voice singing softly as she worked. The melody was unfamiliar, the words barely audible, but there was something achingly beautiful about it, something that spoke of longing and loss and hope all tangled together. Caleb stood frozen, listening, and felt something shift deep in his chest, not quite breaking, not quite healing, something in between, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of caring too much. The singing stopped. Nora must have sensed his presence because she turned, meeting his eyes through the window. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Caleb saw his own confusion reflected back, this impossible situation they'd stumbled into, this connection neither of them had asked for but couldn't seem to resist. Then Poppy called out, "Mr. Caleb, come see my picture." The spell broke. Caleb opened the door and stepped into the warmth and light and life that had taken over his house, and tried not to think about what would happen when it all inevitably fell apart. Because it would fall apart. Experience had taught him that much. Things this good, this right, this necessary, they never lasted. But for tonight, with Poppy showing him her crayon drawing of horses and kittens, with Nora placing a plate of food in front of him that smelled like comfort and home, with the summer evening cooling down outside and the house warm and full inside. For tonight, he let himself believe it might be different. The pretense lasted exactly 3 more days. Caleb knew it was coming, could feel it building like the summer storms that gathered on the horizon, all dark promise and inevitable violence. Crow hadn't returned to the ranch, but his presence lingered in town like a stain. Tom reported hearing him at the saloon, asking questions, buying drinks, spreading his version of events to anyone who would listen. A poor businessman victimized by a thieving employee. A child kept from proper care by a mother too selfish to see reason. $50 for information, $100 for her actual whereabouts. Money talked in frontier towns. It always had. On the 3rd day, Caleb rode into town for supplies and found Mrs. Halstead at the mercantile waiting for him with troubled eyes. "Mr. Hartman," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "That man who's been asking questions. Mr. Crow. He was here yesterday, asking about your household, asking if I'd seen a woman and child at your ranch." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you'd posted a notice for a cook 3 weeks back, and that you must have hired someone because you haven't been back looking for help." She hesitated. "He seemed very interested in that timing." "I'm sure he was." "Mr. Hartman," Mrs. Halstead lowered her voice even further. I don't know what trouble you've gotten yourself into, but that man is dangerous. He's got money and he's got connections. The sheriff's already talking about how respectable Mr. Crow is, how concerned he is about this poor woman who's clearly not in her right mind. He's building a case, and he's doing it smart. Nora Wren is my employee, Caleb said firmly. She cooks and keeps house in exchange for room and board. That's legal employment, not harboring a fugitive. That may be true, but if he's got the law convinced she's a thief, then he's lying. And lies don't become truth just because a rich man tells them. Mrs. Halstead's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy mixed with resignation. In my experience, Mr. Hartman, lies told by rich men become truth more often than we'd like to think. She was right, and they both knew it. Caleb loaded his supplies in grim silence, paid, and headed back to the ranch. The ride home felt longer than usual, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him with every mile. He'd promised Nora safety. He'd promised Poppy protection. But promises meant nothing against money and power and a legal system that favored men like Gideon Crow. He was still half a mile from the house when he saw the riders. 3 men on horseback, approaching from the east. One wore a badge that caught the sunlight even at this distance. The sheriff. And beside him, sitting straight and satisfied in his saddle, was Gideon Crow. Caleb's stomach dropped, but he kept dust at a steady walk, his expression neutral. Panicking wouldn't help. Neither would running. The only thing he could do was face this head-on and hope that right mattered more than money. Hope. That dangerous, treacherous thing. He met them on the road, blocking their path to his ranch house. The sheriff, a stocky man named Dawson who'd held the position for 6 years, raised a hand in greeting that was more formal than friendly. "Hartman," Dawson said, his tone carefully neutral. "Need to have a word with you." "Sheriff?" Caleb nodded, then let his gaze slide to Crow. "Mr. Crow, didn't expect to see you again so soon." Crow's smile was cold and victorious. "I told you I was thorough in my pursuits, Mr. Hartman. The sheriff here has been kind enough to help me in my search for Mrs. Wren." "That's so?" Caleb looked back at Dawson. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Dawson shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Crow has filed a formal complaint regarding a Mrs. Nora Wren. Says she stole from him, money and goods totaling near $200. He's got documentation, account books showing the debt. Now, I hear tell you might have employed a woman matching her description." "I employed a cook," Caleb said carefully. "Woman named Nora. She showed up looking for work about 3 weeks back. I hired her. That's the extent of it." "And the child?" Crow interjected smoothly. "Surely you noticed the child. A little girl, approximately 2 years of age?" "She's got a daughter. What of it?" "That child," Crow said, his voice taking on a tone of false concern, "is being kept in unsuitable conditions by a mother who is clearly mentally unstable. I have documentation from a physician in Montana stating that Mrs. Wren suffered a breakdown after her husband's death, that she's prone to delusions and paranoia. The child needs proper care, Mr. Hartman, not to be dragged across territories by a woman who doesn't know what's best for her." The lies were so smooth, so carefully constructed, delivered with such conviction that Caleb could see Dawson wavering. This was how it worked. This was how men like Crow won, not with truth, but with the appearance of truth, backed by enough money and documentation to make their version of events seem inevitable. "Sheriff," Caleb said, keeping his voice level with effort, "Nora Wren is employed on my ranch. She's a good worker, takes excellent care of her child, and shows no signs of instability. Whatever Mr. Crow claims she owes him, that's a civil matter, not criminal. Unless you've got a warrant." "I do, actually." Dawson pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, and Caleb's heart sank. "Judge in Montana issued it based on Mr. Crow's evidence. I'm authorized to bring Mrs. Wren in for questioning and to place the child in temporary custody pending investigation into the mother's fitness." "You can't do that." The words came out harder than Caleb intended. "That child hasn't done anything wrong. Taking her from her mother is in her best interest," Crow finished, his eyes glittering with triumph. "I assure you, Mr. Hartman, this pains me as much as it does you, but sometimes we must make difficult decisions to protect the innocent." Caleb wanted to hit him, wanted to drag him off that expensive horse and make him bleed for every lie. every manipulation, every ounce of fear he'd inflicted on Nora and Poppy. But violence would only prove Crow's point, that Caleb was too emotionally involved, too willing to protect a woman he barely knew over the law. "Sheriff," Caleb tried again, hearing the desperation creeping into his voice despite his best efforts. "This isn't right. You know it isn't. Crow's lying about the debt, about Nora's mental state, about all of it. He's a—" "Careful, Mr. Hartman," Dawson interrupted, his expression hardening. "I understand you feel loyalty to your employee, but accusing a man of Mr. Crow standing without evidence is slander. Now I've got a warrant to execute. You going to let me do my job, or are we going to have a problem?" The threat was clear. Resist, and Caleb would find himself arrested for obstruction. Then there'd be no one standing between Nora and Crow's reach. "No problem," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. "But I'm coming with you, and I'm getting her a lawyer." "That's your right," Dawson said, almost relieved. "But right now I need you to come peaceful-like." "And my daughter?" Nora's arms tightened around Poppy. "What happens to her?" Crow dismounted with theatrical reluctance. "I'll be taking custody of the child temporarily. I've arranged for her to stay with a respectable family in town." "Like hell you will!" The words exploded from Nora with such force that everyone flinched. "You're not taking my daughter. I'll die before I let you touch her." "Mama?" Poppy's small voice was terrified. "Mama, what's happening?" "Mrs. Wren," Dawson said, his hand moving toward his gun in warning. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder?" Nora's laugh was wild, edged with panic. "You're trying to steal my child based on the lies of a man who's been hunting us for weeks, and you think I'm making this hard?" Caleb stepped forward, placing himself between Nora and the sheriff. "Dawson, listen to me. Give me one day. Let me get a lawyer. Let us present our side before you separate a mother from her child. One day. That's all I'm asking." "The warrant is immediate," Crow said coldly. "Every hour that child remains with an unfit mother is an hour of potential harm." "She's not unfit," Caleb turned on him, all pretense of civility abandoned. "You're a liar and a predator, and everyone here knows it. You hunted this woman because she had the courage to refuse you, and now you're using the law as a weapon because you can't stand being told no." Crow's expression went ice cold. "Those are serious accusations, Mr. Hartman. I hope you can back them up in court, because I will be filing suit for slander." "File whatever you want. I'll say it again, under oath if needed." "Caleb," Nora's voice cut through his rising anger. He turned to find her looking at him with something like gratitude mixed with resignation. "Stop, please. Nora, I can fight this. I can get you help. And while you're fighting, what happens to Poppy?" She kissed her daughter's head, breathing in deeply as if trying to memorize the scent. "If I resist, they'll take her by force. At least this way. At least I can say goodbye." "Mama, no!" Poppy clung tighter, starting to cry. "Don't let them take you, please!" The sound of that child's terror, the raw desperation in her voice, broke something in Caleb. He looked at Dawson, at Crow's triumphant expression, at the third rider who'd stayed silent through all of this, and felt a rage so pure it left him shaking. "This is wrong," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You all know it's wrong, and you're doing it anyway." "I'm doing my job," Dawson said, but he wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. "Mrs. Wren, I need you to hand over the child and come with me." "No, no, no!" Nora was crying now too, holding Poppy so tight the little girl could barely breathe. "Please, she's just a baby. She needs me. Please don't do this." Crow stepped forward, reaching for Poppy. "Come now, child. We're going to take you somewhere safe." "Don't you touch her!" Nora jerked back, and suddenly everything was chaos. Dawson moved to restrain Nora. She fought like a wildcat, screaming, kicking, trying desperately to keep hold of her daughter. Poppy was shrieking, terrified, not understanding why these men were hurting her mother. Crow tried again to grab the child, and Caleb's control finally snapped. He grabbed Crow's arm and shoved him back hard enough that the man stumbled. "Get your hands off them." "Hartman, back off!" Dawson's gun was out now, pointed at Caleb. "I don't want to arrest you too, but I will." "Then do it!" Caleb shouted. "Arrest me for trying to stop you from ripping a child from her mother's arms. See how that looks when the whole territory hears about it." For a moment, everything hung in balance. Dawson's hand wavered on his gun. Crow was picking himself up, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. Nora stood frozen, Poppy screaming in her arms, both of them understanding that this was the end, that nothing Caleb said or did would change what was about to happen. Then Tom's voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative. "Sheriff, might want to hold on a minute." Everyone turned to find Tom standing at the corner of the house, a rifle held loosely in his arms. Not pointed at anyone, but present. A statement. Behind him, Jack and Eli emerged, similarly armed. "We don't want any trouble," Tom continued, his weathered face expressionless. "But we're not real comfortable watching a child get torn from her mama based on some rich man's say-so. Seems to us this whole situation needs more thinking and less doing." Dawson's face went red. "You're threatening a lawman? That's a hanging offense, Tom." "Not threatening anyone, Sheriff. Just suggesting maybe you give Mr. Hartman his one day. Let him get legal representation for Mrs. Wren. Let everyone calm down and approach this proper-like." Tom's eyes were steady, unwavering. "We've all known each other a long time. You know none of us want violence, but we also won't stand by while something this wrong happens on our land." The standoff stretched, tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Caleb could see Dawson calculating odds, weighing his options. 3 armed men, all known to be steady shots. A situation that could turn bloody in seconds. And for what? To enforce a warrant that even he seemed uncomfortable with? Crow, however, had no such doubts. "Sheriff, these men are obstructing justice. Arrest them all." "Shut up, Crow." Dawson didn't take his eyes off Tom. "This is my jurisdiction, and I'll handle it my way." "I'll have your badge for this." "I said shut up!" Dawson's temper finally broke through his professional veneer. He holstered his gun slowly, his gaze still fixed on Tom and the others. "One day, Hartman. You've got until this time tomorrow to get Mrs. Wren proper legal representation and present evidence for why this warrant shouldn't be executed. But if you don't show, or if that evidence isn't compelling, I'll be back with more men, and things will go harder for everyone. Understood?" Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. Dawson turned to Crow, who looked like he wanted to explode. "We're leaving. Now." "This is absurd. The law is clear." "The law is also clear about mob violence, and I'm not interested in starting a range war over a civil debt dispute." Dawson grabbed his horse's reins. "One day won't matter in the long run, and it might prevent bloodshed. That's worth the delay." Crow's face was a mask of controlled fury, but he was smart enough to recognize when he'd lost this particular battle. "Very well, Sheriff. One day. But I will be documenting every irregularity in this situation. Mr. Hartman, you and your men will answer for this obstruction." "Looking forward to it," Caleb said flatly. They mounted and rode off, Crow stiff with barely contained rage, Dawson troubled and torn. The moment they were out of sight, Nora's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the porch steps, still holding Poppy, both of them shaking with released terror and exhaustion. Caleb dropped to his knees beside them. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" Nora shook her head, unable to speak. Poppy had her face buried in her mother's neck, still crying but quieter now, exhausted. Tom and the others lowered their rifles, the tension draining from the yard like water from a broken dam. Nobody spoke for a long moment, the reality of what they'd just done settling over all of them. They'd defied a sheriff, threatened law enforcement, committed what could easily be construed as armed rebellion against legal authority. For a woman and child, they'd known less than a month. "Thank you," Caleb said finally, looking up at his men. "All of you. That was... Thank you." "Wasn't right," Jack said simply. "What they were trying to do wasn't right, and we couldn't let it happen." "Still," Caleb continued, "you all know what this means. Crow will push for charges. You could lose more than your jobs over this." Eli shrugged, unconcerned. "Been thrown out of better places for worse reasons. If standing up for what's right costs me a job, I'll find another." Tom nodded agreement. "Besides, we're invested now. Can't back out halfway through." Their loyalty humbled him. These were good men, better than he deserved, and they'd just put everything on the line for strangers because it was the right thing to do. "We've got one day," Caleb said, forcing himself to focus. "One day to find a lawyer, build a case, and figure out how to beat Crow at his own game. Then we better stop sitting around and start moving," Tom said practically. Jack, ride to the next county, see if Judge Morrison is still practicing law. He's retired, but he might consult. Eli, head into town, quiet-like. See if you can find anyone who's had dealings with Crow. Get their stories, their names. I'll stay here, keep watch in case Crow decides one day is too long to wait. Everyone moved at once, purpose driving out the lingering fear. Within minutes, Jack and Eli were riding out. Tom was checking sightlines around the ranch, and Caleb was helping Nora to her feet. "Come inside, Mumutz," he said gently. "You need to sit down properly. Have some water. We'll figure this out." Nora let him guide her into the house, Poppy still clinging to her. In the kitchen, she finally set her daughter down, and Poppy immediately wrapped herself around Nora's legs, unwilling to let go. "It's okay, baby," Nora murmured, stroking Poppy's hair. "We're safe. We're okay." But her eyes, when they met Caleb's, told a different story. They both knew they'd only delayed the inevitable. One day wasn't enough time to dismantle the case Crow had built, to counter the documentation he'd forged, to fight money and power with nothing but truth and desperation. "I should leave," Nora said quietly. "Tonight, before they come back. Take Poppy and run, get far enough away that—" "No!" Caleb's voice was firm. "No more running. We fight this here, now, with the law on our side for once." "The law is on his side, Caleb. You saw that warrant. You heard Dawson. They believe him. Because he's the only one telling his version. Tomorrow, you'll tell yours. And I'll be standing right beside you when you do." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Why? Why are you doing this? You've already risked so much, and it's only going to get worse. Crow won't stop. He'll destroy you, your ranch, everyone who's helped me. I can't let that happen." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, exhaustion and adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. "You remember what I said that first night, when you asked why I stopped to help you? You said because I needed help, and you could give it. That's still true. But it's more than that now." He looked at Poppy, who'd finally released her death grip on her mother's legs and was sitting on the floor, thumb in her mouth, eyes wide and traumatized. "That little girl showed me kittens and named them. She asked me if I'd make her leave, and I promised her I wouldn't. I don't break my promises, Nora. Not to children, not to you. Caleb, and besides," he continued, a grim smile touching his lips, "I haven't been this angry in 11 years. Feels good to care about something again, even if what I'm caring about is making sure Gideon Crow doesn't win." Nora laughed, a broken, desperate sound, and then she was crying in earnest, all the fear and relief and gratitude pouring out. Caleb let her cry, understanding that she needed this release, that she'd been holding it together for weeks and couldn't anymore. When she finally quieted, she wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I need to tell you everything, all of it. No more half-truths or vague explanations. If we're going to fight this, you need to know exactly what happened." "All right." Caleb settled back, preparing to listen. "Tell me." So she did. She told him about her husband, a good man who died in a mining accident 2 years ago, leaving her widowed with a baby and no money. About Crow's boarding house in Montana, where she'd taken work out of desperation. About Crow's slow, calculated pursuit, flattery at first, then gifts she couldn't refuse without insulting him, then pressure disguised as concern for her welfare. She told him about the night Crow had cornered her in the kitchen, his hands on her even as she said no, his voice smooth and reasonable as he explained that she owed him for his generosity, that refusing him was ungrateful and foolish, about how she'd fought him off, how he'd laughed and told her she'd come around eventually. They always did. She told him about the account books that appeared overnight, documenting debts she'd never incurred, items she'd supposedly stolen, money she'd allegedly borrowed. About Crow's ultimatum, submit to him willingly, or he'd have her arrested and take Poppy to pay the debt. She told him about running, about 3 weeks of terror and desperation, about sleeping in barns and abandoned houses, about walking until her feet bled because she couldn't risk being seen in towns, about watching Poppy get sicker and being powerless to help her. And she told him about collapsing on the road, about being so certain they were going to die that she'd been praying for it to be quick, to not let Poppy suffer. "Then you stopped," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. "You stopped, and you helped us. And for the first time in weeks I thought maybe we had a chance. But now Now we still have a chance, Caleb said firmly. Because everything you just told me, that's a pattern of abuse and coercion. That's a man using his power to victimize women who have no recourse. And I'm willing to bet you're not the first woman he's done this to. Nora's eyes widened. You think there are others? Men like Crow don't start with elaborate schemes. They work up to them, which means there are probably other women with similar stories, if we can find them. He stood, energy returning despite his exhaustion. That's what we'll do tomorrow. Present you to the judge, tell your story, and if we can, bring evidence that Crow has a history of this behavior. Turn his own pattern against him. It won't be enough, Nora said, but there was hope creeping into her voice despite her words. He's too careful, maybe, but it's more than we had an hour ago. And tomorrow, with a lawyer and witnesses, and the truth laid out plain, we'll have even more. Caleb met her eyes, willing her to believe. I know you've been fighting alone for a long time, but you're not alone anymore. You've got me and Tom and Jack and Eli. You've got people willing to stand with you. That's got to count for something. Nora stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. Her grip was strong despite the trembling. It counts for everything, she said quietly. Everything. They stood like that for a moment, hands linked, the kitchen warm around them despite the darkness gathering outside. Poppy had fallen asleep on the floor, exhausted by fear and tears. The house was quiet, except for the soft sound of their breathing. Tomorrow would bring more fights, more fear, more uncertainty. Tomorrow they'd face judges and lawyers and a man who'd built an empire on cruelty and exploitation. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other. They had hope. They had one day to make right what Crow had spent years twisting into ugliness. It would have to be enough. Because the alternative, letting Crow win, letting Poppy be taken, letting Nora be dragged back to face charges built on lies, that wasn't something Caleb could accept. Not anymore. Not when he'd finally found something worth fighting for. Outside, the summer night pressed close and heavy. Inside, Caleb Hartman stood holding the hands of a woman he'd known less than a month, protecting a child who'd named his barn cats, preparing for a battle he wasn't sure he could win. And for the first time in 11 years, he felt completely, terrifyingly alive. Dawn came too fast and brought Jack Morrison with it. The retired judge arrived at first light, his buggy raising dust on the road, his silver hair catching the early sun like a beacon. He was in his 70s, but moved with the energy of a much younger man, his eyes sharp and assessing as he climbed down from his seat. Caleb Hartman, he said, extending a weathered hand. Jack said you needed help. Didn't expect to find you tangled up in something like this. Caleb shook his hand, grateful beyond words that the old judge had come. Appreciate you riding out, Judge Morrison. I know you're retired. Retired from the bench, not from giving a damn about justice. Morrison's gaze moved to where Nora stood in the doorway, Poppy clutched against her side. That the woman Crow's hunting? Yes, sir, Nora Wren, and her daughter Poppy. Morrison studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, decisively. Let's hear it then, all of it. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. They gathered in the kitchen, and Nora told her story again. This time, she didn't cry, didn't let her voice waver. She laid out the facts with brutal clarity, Crow's pursuit, his fabricated debts, his threats against Poppy, the 3 weeks of running. Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small leather book, his face growing grimmer with each detail. When Nora finished, Morrison set down his pen and looked at Caleb. You believe her? Every word. Why? You've known her, 3 weeks? Crow's got documentation, witnesses in Montana, a reputation as a successful businessman. What makes you so certain she's telling the truth and he's the liar? Caleb met the old judge's eyes directly. Because I've seen how she is with her daughter. I've watched her work herself to exhaustion trying to earn her keep here. I've seen her jump at every unexpected sound, seen the fear that never quite leaves her eyes. He paused. And because I met Crow, talked to him, saw how he operates. That man doesn't give a damn about justice or a stolen debt. He cares about control, about winning, about making sure a woman who dared say no to him suffers for it. Morrison nodded slowly. That tracks with what Eli found out in town last night. Seems Crow's got a history in Montana territory. 3 other women who worked for him over the past 5 years. All left suddenly, all under circumstances that raised eyebrows. One ended up in an asylum, claiming Crow had her committed after she refused him. Another disappeared entirely. Some say she headed to California, others say she's dead. Third one married quickly, almost desperately, to get away from him. Nora's face had gone white. I didn't know. I thought I was the only one. Men like Crow count on that, Morrison said. They isolate their victims, make them think they're alone, that no one will believe them, makes it easier to control the narrative. He tapped his notes. The problem is, everything I just told you is hearsay, rumors and speculation. In court, it won't hold up against Crow's documentation unless we can get one of those women to testify. Can we? Caleb asked. Find them? Convince them to come forward? Maybe, but not in one day. Morrison's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Caleb, I'll do everything I can. I'll argue that the warrant was issued without proper evidence, that Crow's claims need investigation before any custody changes are made. But I need you to understand the reality here. Crow's got money, lawyers, and a paper trail that looks legitimate. We've got Nora's testimony and not much else. Unless Sheriff Dawson is willing to give us more time, he won't, Caleb said flatly. He made that clear. One day, and if we don't have compelling evidence, he's executing that warrant. Morrison stood, gathering his papers. Then we better make this one day count. Nora, you'll need to come with me into town. We'll present your case to the circuit judge, man named Blackwood, fair but conservative. Likes evidence more than emotion. Caleb, you'll need to come too, as her employer. Bring those account books from your ranch. Show she's been working legitimately. What about Poppy? Nora's voice was tight with fear. I can't bring her into town, not with Crow there. She stays here, Tom said from the doorway. None of them had heard him approach. With me and the boys. Anyone wants to get to her, they'll have to go through us. Nora looked torn, maternal instinct warring with necessity. Caleb moved to her side, his voice gentle. Tom's right. She's safer here than in town, and if things go wrong, if they try to execute that warrant, at least she won't see it happen. The thought of things going wrong, of being dragged away while Poppy watched, was clearly unbearable. But Nora nodded, bending down to her daughter's eye level. Baby, I need you to stay here with Mr. Tom today. Can you do that for Mama? Poppy's lower lip trembled. Are you coming back? Yes, I promise I'm coming back. Nora pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair. But I need you to be very brave. Can you be brave for me? I'll try, Mama. That's my girl. Nora kissed her forehead, her cheeks, held her like she was trying to memorize the feeling. When she finally let go, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her expression was resolute. They left within the hour, Morrison's buggy leading the way, Caleb riding alongside on dust. Nora sat rigid in the buggy seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't speak during the ride, and Caleb didn't push her. He understood she was preparing herself, building whatever walls she'd need to face Crow again without falling apart. Town was quiet when they arrived, the main street mostly empty in the early morning heat. But Caleb noticed the curtains twitching in windows, the way people stopped their conversations to stare as they passed. Word had spread. Everyone knew about the confrontation yesterday, about the standoff, about the woman at the center of it all. The courthouse was a modest building at the end of the street, wood-framed and weather-beaten but solid. Judge Blackwood's chambers were on the second floor, and Morrison led them up the narrow stairs with the confidence of a man who'd walked them 1,000 times. Blackwood was already there, seated behind a desk piled high with papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He was younger than Morrison by a decade, with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples, and the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent years on the frontier before turning to law. Judge Morrison, Blackwood said, standing to shake hands. Heard you'd come out of retirement. Must be something serious. It is, William. This is Caleb Hartman and Mrs. Nora Wren. We're here regarding the warrant issued against Mrs. Wren by a Montana judge at the request of Gideon Crow. Blackwood's expression grew guarded. Mr. Crow is here in town, filed proper paperwork, brought documentation. Said you might try to interfere. We're not interfering, Morrison said calmly. We're presenting the other side of the story. Something that should have been done before any warrant was issued. The warrant is legal and binding. The warrant was issued based on fraudulent claims, Morrison interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. Gideon Crow is a predator who uses his wealth and position to victimize vulnerable women. Mrs. Wren is not a thief. She's a victim of sustained harassment and coercion. Blackwood sighed and sat back down, gesturing for them to take seats. All right, I'll hear you out. But understand, I can't just dismiss a legal warrant because... I'm not asking you to dismiss it, Morrison said. I'm asking you to delay its execution until proper investigation can be conducted. Give us time to gather evidence, to find the other women Crow has targeted, to build a case that shows his pattern of behavior. How much time? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Blackwood shook his head. That's a lot to ask, Judge Morrison. Mr. Crow is a respected businessman. He's got witnesses, account books, even a physician's statement regarding Mrs. Wren's mental state, all of which are fabrications, Nora said, her voice cutting through the men's discussion like a knife. Both judges turned to look at her, and she straightened in her chair, meeting their gazes without flinching. I never stole anything from Gideon Crow. The debts he claims I owe are invented. The physician who supposedly examined me never laid eyes on me, and the only reason I'm here, the only reason I ran, is because Crow wouldn't accept that I wasn't for sale. The blunt words hung in the air. Blackwood's expression shifted, something like discomfort crossing his features. Mrs. Wren, he said carefully, those are serious allegations. And what Crow's doing isn't. She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. He's using the law as a weapon because I said no to him. He's trying to take my daughter away because he knows that's the one thing that will break me. And if you execute that warrant, if you let him win, you're telling every other woman in his path that the law won't protect them. That money and power matter more than truth. The law requires evidence, Blackwood said, but he sounded less certain now. Then let me provide it. Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn and creased from handling. This is a letter Crow sent me 2 days before I left Montana. Read it. See for yourself what kind of man you're helping. Blackwood took the letter, unfolded it, and began to read. Caleb watched his expression change. Surprise, then distaste, then something harder. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully, as if it were contaminated. This is explicit, he said finally. It's evidence, Morrison said. Evidence that Crow's interest in Mrs. Wren was not professional, that his pursuit of her was personal and inappropriate. Combined with the testimony of other women he's targeted, this establishes a pattern. What other women? You have them here, ready to testify? Not yet, but give us time and we'll find them. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the desk. Even if I wanted to grant a delay, and I'm not saying I do, I'd need Sheriff Dawson's cooperation. The warrant is his to execute. Then let's talk to Dawson, Morrison said. But before anyone could move, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, and Gideon Crow strode into the chamber like he owned it. He was dressed impeccably despite the heat, his expression pleasant until his eyes landed on Nora. Then something cold and satisfied flashed across his features. Judge Blackwood, he said smoothly, ignoring everyone else in the room. I heard my name being discussed. I hope you're not allowing these people to waste the court's time with baseless accusations. Mr. Crow, Blackwood said, his tone carefully neutral. We're just reviewing all the evidence before proceeding. What evidence? I've presented everything required by law. Account books, witness statements, physician reports, all properly documented and notarized. What have they presented? The word of a disturbed woman and the misplaced loyalty of a rancher who's known her less than a month? Crow's voice dripped with disdain. This is a waste of everyone's time. This, Morrison said, picking up Nora's letter, is a communication you sent Mrs. Wren. Would you like to explain its contents to Judge Blackwood? Crow barely glanced at it. That's a private letter, taken without my permission, hardly admissible as evidence. It was sent to me, Nora said coldly. That makes it mine to do with as I please. Does it? Crow turned to her finally, his expression shifting to something that made Caleb's hands curl into fists. Nora, dear, I understand you're frightened. I understand you've convinced yourself that running was the right choice. But this? Dragging these good people into your delusions, making wild accusations, it only proves what I've been saying. You're not well. You need help, not indulgence. The condescension, the casual cruelty disguised as concern, was masterful. Caleb could see how it would work on people who didn't know better, how reasonable it sounded coming from a well-dressed man with confidence and documentation. But Nora didn't flinch. I'm not sick, Crow. And I'm not delusional. I'm just done pretending that what you did to me was anything other than what it was. What I did? Crow's facade cracked slightly, anger bleeding through. I gave you employment when you were destitute. I offered you security, a future, and you repaid me with theft and slander. You cornered me in a kitchen, Nora said, her voice steady and clear. You put your hands on me while I begged you to stop. You told me I owed you, that refusing you was ungrateful. Then when I ran, you invented debts and crimes to justify hunting me across 3 territories. That's not employment, Mr. Crow. That's abuse. The room went dead silent. Even Crow seemed momentarily thrown by her directness, by the absolute absence of shame or fear in her voice. Then he laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. This is precisely what I warned you about, Judge Blackwood. She's unstable, prone to hysterics and fabrication. Everything she's saying is a fantasy designed to justify her theft. I have documentation proving every claim I've made. What does she have? Stories, emotions, the manipulation of men who should know better. She has this letter, Morrison said, which you wrote, which details your explicit intentions toward her, which proves your interest was never professional. A letter written in frustration to an employee who was being deliberately obtuse about her duties, Crow countered smoothly, taken out of context, twisted to support her narrative. I assure you, Judge, if you examine my actual employment records, you'll see that Mrs. Wren was paid fairly, treated well, and given every opportunity to succeed. Her decision to steal from me and flee was entirely her own. Caleb couldn't stay silent anymore. Judge Blackwood, there are at least 3 other women who worked for Crow and left under similar circumstances. One was committed to an asylum. Another disappeared. The third married in what everyone described as desperation. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. Crow's eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, Mr. Hartman. Slander is a serious offense. So is perjury, Caleb shot back. And I'm betting if we dig into those account books of yours, we'll find all kinds of interesting discrepancies. My accounts are impeccable. Then you won't mind if we have them audited, Morrison interjected. Thoroughly. By an independent accountant. For the first time, genuine anger flashed across Crow's face. This is harassment. I came here in good faith, following proper legal channels, and now I'm being accused of crimes based on nothing but the ravings of a hysterical woman and the misguided chivalry of men who don't know when they're being manipulated. I know manipulation when I see it, Caleb said quietly. And the only person manipulating anyone in this room is you. Crow turned on him, all pretense of civility abandoned. You've made a very serious mistake, Mr. Hartman. When this is over, when Mrs. Wren is in custody, and that child is placed with a proper family, I will make certain you pay for this interference. Your ranch, your reputation, everything you've built. I'll take it all apart, piece by piece. Try it, Caleb said. I'll be waiting. Gentlemen, Blackwood's voice cut through the rising tension. That's enough. This is a court of law, not a saloon. Now both of you sit down and let me think. Everyone complied, though the room still crackled with hostility. Blackwood removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and seemed to age 10 years in the span of a breath. This is a mess, he said finally. Mr. Crow, you've got documentation and a legal warrant. Mrs. Wren, you've got serious allegations and what appears to be a compromising letter. Judge Morrison, you're asking for time to build a case. And Mr. Hartman, you're ready to start a range war over a woman you barely know. I know her well enough, Caleb said. That may be, but feelings aren't facts. Blackwood put his glasses back on, his expression troubled. Here's what I'm willing to do. I'll give you 72 hours, 3 days. In that time, Judge Morrison, you find me something concrete. Other victims willing to testify. Documentation of Crow's pattern of behavior. Anything that establishes this is more than a dispute between an employer and an employee. If you can do that, I'll consider suspending the warrant pending full investigation. If you can't... He looked at Nora, his expression sympathetic but firm. Then Sheriff Dawson will execute the warrant as issued. 3 days isn't enough, Morrison protested. It's more than I should be giving, Blackwood countered. Mr. Crow has followed proper procedure. I'm already extending considerable courtesy by delaying it all. He turned to Crow. And you, sir, will make yourself available during this period should Judge Morrison have questions or need access to your records. Crow's smile was thin and sharp. Of course, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide. Then we're adjourned. Mrs. Wren, you're free to return to Mr. Hartman's ranch, but you are not to leave the territory. Mr. Crow, you're not to approach Mrs. Wren or the child during this period. Sheriff Dawson will enforce that order. Everyone clear? They nodded, and the meeting dissolved. Crow left first, his departure radiating smug confidence. He'd gotten what he wanted. A limited window, impossible odds, and the law still fundamentally on his side. Morrison waited until they were alone to speak. 3 days. We need to find those women and get them here, willing to testify. How? Nora asked, despair creeping into her voice. We don't even know where they are. We know where they were, Caleb said, an idea forming. Montana, Crow's boarding houses. We start there, ask around, follow the trail. That's a week's travel at least, Morrison said. We don't have a week. Then we split up, Caleb said. I'll go to Montana, you stay here and dig into Crow's business dealings. There has to be something in his financial records, some proof of fraud or coercion. Nora can help you go through everything. Caleb, that's dangerous, Nora said. If Crow realizes what you're doing, he already knows we're fighting back. Might as well make it count. Caleb looked at Morrison. Can you hold things together here for 3 days? I can try. But Caleb, understand what you're asking. You'll need to find these women, convince them to come forward, get them back here, all in 72 hours. The odds? I don't care about odds, Caleb interrupted. I care about keeping my promise to Poppy that I wouldn't let anyone take her mother away. If that means riding to Montana and back in 3 days, then that's what I'll do. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, get moving. I'll telegraph ahead, see if I can get you names and locations before you arrive. Every hour counts now. They left the courthouse together, stepping out into sunlight that felt too bright, too normal for the weight of what they carried. Crow was across the street, talking to Sheriff Dawson, and both men looked up as Nora and Caleb emerged. The hatred in Crow's eyes was palpable, barely contained. Caleb met that gaze evenly, letting Crow see his own determination reflected back. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I'm coming with you, Nora said as they reached Morrison's buggy. No, you need to stay here, help Morrison, be there for Poppy. Poppy is safe with Tom, and Morrison doesn't need me to search through papers. Nora's voice was firm, brooking no argument. Those women, the ones Crow hurt, they won't trust a man they don't know, but they might trust another woman, someone who survived what they survived. She was right, and Caleb knew it, but the thought of bringing her into potential danger, of having her face Crow's allies and victims, and the ghosts of what he'd done. Please, Nora said quietly. Let me fight for this. Let me be part of saving my own life instead of just waiting while everyone else decides my fate. How could he deny her that? After everything she'd endured, everything she'd survived, she deserved to be an active participant in her own rescue. All right, he said. We leave within the hour. Pack light. We'll be riding hard. Nora nodded, determination replacing the despair that had shadowed her since Crow arrived. Thank you for trusting me, for everything. Caleb wanted to say something profound, something that captured the complexity of what he felt, the protectiveness, the admiration, the growing certainty that this woman had become essential to him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. But words failed him, so he simply nodded and helped her into the buggy. They had 3 days to accomplish the impossible, and if they failed, Nora would be arrested, Poppy would be taken, and Crow would win. Caleb had already lost everyone who mattered once. He'd survived it, barely, by shutting down everything inside himself that could feel pain. But he'd open those doors again, let light and life and hope back in. He couldn't survive losing it all twice, so he wouldn't. Whatever it took, however impossible the odds, he'd find those women. He'd bring them back. He'd make sure truth mattered more than money. And if that meant riding straight into hell to drag justice back by its throat, then that's exactly what he'd do. The summer sun beat down as they rode back to the ranch to prepare. Behind them, Gideon Crow watched from the shadows, his expression cold and calculating. The battle had begun, and only one side could win. They rode out within the hour, pushing the horses harder than was wise, but knowing time mattered more than caution. Caleb had chosen his fastest mare, and Nora rode one of the steadier geldings, both animals saddled light for speed. The goodbye with Poppy had been brief and devastating. The little girl clinging to her mother, Nora whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, Tom standing silent witness with his weathered face set in grim determination. 3 days, Tom had said as they mounted. We'll keep her safe that long. You just make sure you come back. Now the ranch was hours behind them, and Montana territory stretched ahead like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. They'd ridden through the worst heat of the day without stopping, watering the horses at every creek but never lingering, eating dried meat and hardtack in the saddle. Conversation was sparse, both of them saving energy for what lay ahead. It was near dusk when Nora finally spoke, her voice rough from dust and disuse. The first boarding house is in Helena. That's where I worked, where the others were before me. How many worked there while you were? Maybe a dozen women at any given time. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. Most were older, widowed, or never married. But there were always one or two younger ones, pretty ones. Her jaw tightened. Those were the ones Crow paid attention to. You remember their names? Some. There was Sarah Brennan. She left about 6 months before I did. Just disappeared one night. Crow said she'd stolen money and run off, but I never believed it. She wasn't the type. Nora paused, thinking. And before her, there was a girl named Margaret Chen, part Chinese, beautiful, quiet. She lasted maybe 2 months before she married a miner twice her age. Everyone thought it was strange how fast it happened, but she seemed desperate to leave. Anyone else? Catherine something. I never knew her last name. She was there when I first arrived, left maybe 3 weeks later. She was the one they said ended up in an asylum. Nora's voice dropped. I saw her once, right before she left. She had bruises on her arms. When I asked about them, she just looked at me with these empty eyes and said, "Don't ever be alone with him, no matter what he offers." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. She say anything else? No, she was gone the next day. Crow told everyone she'd had a breakdown, that her family had taken her somewhere she could get proper care. But I saw the men who took her. They weren't family. They were rough types, the kind you hire when you want something done and don't care how. Did anyone question it? Who would? Nora's laugh was bitter. Crow was the wealthiest man in town. He employed half the population either directly or indirectly. You don't question a man like that, not if you want to keep your job, your home, your place in society. You just look the other way and tell yourself it's not your business. They rode in silence after that, each lost in thoughts about the women Crow had victimized, the system that had protected him, and the slim chance they had of bringing it all crashing down in just 3 days. Night forced them to stop. They made camp in a stand of cottonwoods near a stream, the horses grateful for the rest, both riders too exhausted to do more than eat cold food and spread bedrolls. Caleb built a small fire anyway, more for the comfort of light than warmth, and they sat watching the flames in weary silence. What happens if we can't find them? Nora asked finally. Or if we find them and they won't talk? We keep looking until we do find someone who will. And if we run out of time? Caleb met her eyes across the fire, seeing the fear there, the exhaustion, the desperate hope she was trying not to let herself feel. Then we find another way. But Nora, I need you to understand something. No matter what happens, I'm not giving up. Even if Dawson executes that warrant, even if they arrest you, I'll fight it. I'll appeal. I'll hire every lawyer between here and San Francisco if I have to. You're not facing this alone. Why? The question was barely a whisper. Why are you willing to risk everything for us? He'd asked himself that question 100 times over the past weeks, and the answer had shifted and changed until finally settling into something he could no longer deny. Because when you and Poppy showed up, dying on that road, something in me that had been dead for 11 years woke back up, he said slowly, carefully. I'd convinced myself I was fine living alone, working alone, existing in that silence. Then suddenly there was noise and laughter, and the smell of bread baking and a little girl naming barn cats, and I realized I hadn't been fine at all. I'd just been surviving. You brought me back to life, Nora. Both of you did. So I'm fighting for you because losing you would mean going back to that half-existence, and I can't. I won't. Nora's eyes were bright with tears in the firelight. Caleb, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just telling you why. So you know that this isn't charity or obligation. It's personal. It matters. You matter. She stood then, crossing the small space between them, and did something that surprised them both. She kissed him. Brief and fierce and full of emotion, neither of them had words for. When she pulled back, her hand lingered against his face. When this is over, she said quietly. When Poppy's safe and Crow's defeated and we can breathe again, ask me then. Ask me what I feel, what I want, and I'll tell you. And until then? Until then, we ride to Montana and drag the truth into daylight. She smiled, fragile but real. Together. They slept in shifts, one always keeping watch, and were back in the saddle before dawn. The second day's ride was brutal, endless prairie giving way to rolling hills, the sun relentless, their bodies protesting every mile. But they pushed through, driven by the ticking clock in both their minds. 72 hours. Already a day and a half gone. Helena appeared on the horizon near sunset of the second day, a sprawling mining town built on silver and ambition. Its buildings a mix of elegant Victorian homes and rough-hewn miners' shacks. Crow's boarding house sat on the respectable end of town, a 3-story structure with fresh paint and manicured gardens, the kind of place that screamed wealth and respectability. They didn't go there first. Instead, following information Morrison had telegraphed ahead, they went to a small house on the edge of town where Sarah Brennan was rumored to have family. A middle-aged woman answered the door, her expression wary until Nora introduced herself. I worked with Sarah at Crow's place, Nora said. I need to find her. It's urgent. The woman, Sarah's aunt it turned out, studied them both with sharp eyes. You running from him too? Yes, and he's caught up to me. I have 3 days to prove he's a liar and a predator, or I lose my daughter. Nora's voice cracked on the last word. Please, if you know where Sarah is, if she's willing to talk about what happened. She's in Seattle, the aunt said. Left near 6 months ago, swore she'd never set foot in Montana again, said Crow tried to... She trailed off, glancing at Caleb. Well, said he tried things. And when she wouldn't cooperate, he spread lies about her, made it so she couldn't work anywhere in town. She had to leave everything, start over with nothing. Would she come back to testify? Caleb asked. We'd pay for travel, guarantee her protection. She'd never make it in 3 days, even if she agreed. Seattle's a week away at least. Hope deflated, but Nora pressed on. What about Margaret Chen, the woman who married the miner? The aunt's expression grew grim. Dead. Died in childbirth 8 months after the wedding. Some say it was too soon for the baby to be her husband's, if you understand my meaning. 2 women, both beyond their reach. Caleb felt the clock ticking louder, time slipping away like water through cupped hands. Catherine, Nora said desperately, the woman who was taken to the asylum, do you know where she is? If she's even alive? Alive, last I heard. Place called Morningside Sanctuary, maybe 50 miles north of here, but I don't know if you'll get anything useful from her. They say she doesn't speak anymore. Whatever Crow did to her, it broke something inside. 50 miles. They could make it there and back in a day if they pushed hard. It was a chance. Maybe they're only one. Thank you, Nora said fervently. You've helped more than you know. They rode out immediately despite the failing light, following the directions Sarah's aunt had provided. The road north was rough, cutting through forested hills where the darkness pressed close and full of sounds that made the horses nervous. But they didn't stop, couldn't stop, not with time running out. Morningside Sanctuary revealed itself just after dawn on the third day. A gray stone building surrounded by high walls, more prison than hospital. The woman who answered their knock was dressed in a nurse's uniform, her expression professionally blank. "We're here to see Catherine," Nora said. "I don't know her last name, but she was admitted about a year ago from Helena." "Catherine Mercer," the nurse said after a moment. "Are you family?" "Friends," Caleb lied. "We've been looking for her." The nurse hesitated, then seemed to decide they were harmless enough. "She doesn't see many visitors, doesn't speak at all, actually, but I suppose it couldn't hurt. Follow me." She led them through corridors that smelled of carbolic and despair, past rooms where other patients sat staring at nothing or rocking endlessly. Catherine's room was near the end, a small space with a single window overlooking a barren courtyard. The woman sitting on the bed was young, couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes were ancient, haunted, empty. She didn't look up when they entered, just kept staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Catherine?" Nora approached slowly, carefully. "My name is Nora. I worked at Crow's boarding house in Helena. I think we have something in common." No response. Not even a flicker of recognition. Nora knelt beside the bed, bringing herself to Catherine's eye level. "He hurt you, didn't he? Gideon Crow. He cornered you, forced himself on you, then had you committed when you tried to tell people what he'd done." Still nothing. But Caleb noticed Catherine's hands had started to tremble. "He's doing it again," Nora continued, her voice gentle but urgent. "To me. And if I can't stop him, he'll take my daughter. A little girl, just 2 years old. He'll take her, and I'll never see her again. Catherine, please. If you can hear me, if any part of you remembers what he did, I need you to help me stop him." The silence stretched so long Caleb thought they'd failed. Then Catherine's lips moved, forming words so quiet they were almost inaudible. "He said no one would believe me." Nora's breath caught. "But I believe you, and I need you to help me make sure everyone else does too." Catherine's eyes finally focused, meeting Nora's for the first time. In them, Caleb saw a flicker of something that might have been hope or might have been rage, maybe both. "What do you need?" Catherine whispered. "I need you to come with us, to testify about what Crow did. I know it's asking everything. I know it's terrifying, but when do we leave?" The question was delivered with such flat certainty that Nora almost didn't process it. "You'll come? You'll testify?" "He took everything from me." Catherine's voice was gaining strength, color returning to her cheeks like blood flowing back into a limb that had gone numb. "My reputation, my sanity, my freedom. He put me in this place because I threatened his perfect image. If I can hurt him back, if I can help stop him from doing this to someone else, yes, I'll come." Getting Catherine released required money Caleb didn't have, an authority he couldn't claim, but desperation made him creative. He told the administrator Catherine's family had sent for her, that they were taking her to better care in Wyoming. He paid what he could and promised the rest would follow. Whether the lies held up didn't matter. They'd be gone before anyone thought to verify the story. Within 2 hours, Catherine was dressed in clothes Nora had bought in town, seated on a horse between them, and they were riding south like demons were chasing them. In a sense, they were. The third day was nearly half gone, and they still had to make it back to Wyoming before Dawson's deadline expired. Catherine proved to be a revelation. Away from the asylum, away from the attendants and locked doors, something fierce and focused emerged. She talked as they rode, telling them everything. How Crow had hired her specifically because she was alone in the world, how he'd groomed her carefully before making his move, how he'd assaulted her in his office and then laughed when she threatened to tell the authorities. "He showed me documents," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was describing. "Proof," he called it, "that I'd been stealing from him for months. Forged signatures, falsified accounts, all of it complete fabrication. He said if I breathed a word about what he'd done, he'd have me arrested. And when I tried anyway, when I went to the sheriff, Crow had a doctor waiting. A man he'd paid to declare me insane, to sign papers committing me." "How long were you in Morningside?" Caleb asked. 13 months. 13 months of being told I was crazy, that my memories were delusions, that Crow was a good man who'd tried to help me. They gave me medicine that made everything fuzzy, made it hard to think or fight back. Eventually, it was easier to just stop. Stop talking. Stop resisting. Stop being. But you didn't stop completely, Nora said. Some part of you held on. Some part of me waited, Catherine corrected. For a chance like this. For someone to believe me. They rode through the night again, switching horses at a ranch where Caleb called in an old favor, eating whatever they could grab, sleeping in stolen minutes. Catherine kept pace without complaint, driven by a determination that seemed to burn brighter with every mile closer to Wyoming. Dawn of the fourth day found them still 30 miles from the ranch, and Caleb's stomach was tight with the certainty they wouldn't make it in time. But when they crested a hill and saw the town spread below them, smoke rising from morning fires, the courthouse visible at the far end of the street, something like hope stirred. They rode straight to Morrison's office, their horses lathered and exhausted, all three riders looking like they'd been to hell and back, which, in a sense, they had. Morrison looked up from his desk, his eyes widening. You found someone. Catherine Mercer, Nora said, helping the younger woman dismount. She worked for Crow. She'll testify to everything. Morrison studied Catherine with sharp, assessing eyes, then nodded slowly. Miss Mercer, what Gideon Crow did to you, can you speak about it in court, in front of a judge, with Crow sitting right there? Catherine's jaw set with grim determination. I can. I will. I've been silent for 13 months. I'm done being silent. Then we have a chance. Morrison stood, gathering papers. Blackwood's hearing starts in an hour. Crow's attorneys will fight to exclude Catherine's testimony, claim it's irrelevant to the current charges against Nora. We'll need to establish pattern and practice, show this is systematic behavior. We can do that, Caleb said. We've got Catherine's testimony, the letter Crow sent Nora, and he pulled out a folder he'd been carrying. These financial records I managed to copy from Crow's Helena office. His clerk was persuadable once I mentioned how much a competing boarding house might pay for proof of fraud. Morrison flipped through the documents, his expression growing more satisfied with each page. This is good. This is very good. He's been systematically inflating debts, creating false charges. If we can prove he did this to multiple women, he did, Catherine said. He did it to all of us. Different amounts, different accusations, but always the same threat. Submit or be destroyed. Then let's go destroy him instead. The courthouse was already filling when they arrived, word having spread that the final hearing would determine Nora's fate. Crow sat at the front with two expensive lawyers, his expression confident until he saw Catherine walk in. Then something flickered across his face, shock, quickly masked, followed by calculation. He leaned to whisper to his attorneys, who immediately stood. Your Honor, the lead attorney said before anyone else could speak. We object to the presence of Catherine Mercer. She has no standing in this case, and her testimony would be prejudicial and irrelevant. On the contrary, Morrison said, Miss Mercer's testimony establishes a pattern of behavior directly relevant to the charges against my client. Mr. Crow has accused Mrs. Wren of theft based on fraudulent documentation. Miss Mercer will testify that he used identical tactics against her. Blackwood considered this, his expression thoughtful. I'll allow it. But Miss Mercer, I need you to understand that anything you say here must be truthful and relevant. Perjury is a serious crime. I understand, Your Honor, Catherine said clearly. Everything I'm about to tell you is the truth. What followed was devastating in its simplicity. Catherine laid out her story with unflinching honesty. The grooming, the assault, the forged documents, the forced commitment. Morrison followed with the financial records, showing how Crow had systematically inflated charges against multiple female employees. Then Nora testified, her account matching Catherine's in every significant detail. Different specific events, but the same pattern, the same methods, the same abuse of power. Crow's attorneys fought back hard, attacking Catherine's credibility, pointing out her asylum stay as evidence of instability, questioning Nora's timeline and memory. But the pattern was undeniable. Too many similarities, too much corroborating evidence. When it was Crow's turn to testify, he was smooth and confident, denying everything with practiced ease. He claimed Catherine had been genuinely disturbed, that her accusations were delusions. He insisted Nora's debts were legitimate. that he was merely a businessman trying to recover what was rightfully his. But when Morrison presented the copied financial records showing identical fraudulent charges against 3 different women, Crow's composure cracked. "Those are stolen documents," he sputtered. "Obtained illegally." "Obtained from your own office," Morrison countered, "and showing a clear pattern of fraud. Your Honor, this man has built a system of exploitation and abuse. He targets vulnerable women, manipulates them into positions of dependence, and when they refuse his advances, he destroys them using fabricated legal claims. Catherine Mercer is proof. Nora Wren is proof. These documents are proof." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, studying the evidence, the testimonies, the 2 women who'd found the courage to speak. Then he looked at Crow, and his expression was cold. "Mr. Crow, I'm suspending the warrant against Mrs. Wren pending full investigation into these allegations. Furthermore, I'm ordering a formal audit of your business practices and referring this matter to the territorial attorney for potential criminal charges. You are not to leave the territory, and you are to have no contact whatsoever with Mrs. Wren, Miss Mercer, or anyone associated with either of them." Crow shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is outrageous. These women are liars, manipulators." "These women," Blackwood interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade, "have provided credible testimony and documented evidence of systematic fraud. If their allegations prove true, you'll face charges that could result in significant prison time. I suggest you retain better counsel than what you currently have, because you're going to need it." The gavel came down with finality, and the courtroom erupted. Crow was surrounded by his attorneys, their faces grim as they realized their client had just gone from prosecutor to defendant. Catherine was crying with relief, Nora gripping her hand like a lifeline. Morrison was gathering papers with satisfaction written across every line of his face. And Caleb felt something in his chest loosen, the terrible weight of fear finally lifting after days of carrying it. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, with almost no time, they'd exposed Crow's pattern and turned the law back on itself. Outside the courthouse, in the bright afternoon sun, Nora threw her arms around Caleb with such force he stumbled. "We did it," she said, laughing and crying simultaneously. "We actually did it." "You did it," he corrected. "You and Catherine. You were brave enough to speak truth to power." "We all did it," Catherine said quietly. "Together. That's what he couldn't stand, I think. That we found each other. That we weren't isolated anymore." The ride back to the ranch was nothing like the desperate race to Montana. They took their time, stopped to rest, talked and laughed and made plans. Catherine was coming with them. She had nowhere else to go, and Nora had insisted there was room at the ranch for another person finding her way back to life. When they finally reached the ranch house, Poppy came flying out the door, Tom's arms barely catching her as she launched herself at Nora. The reunion was everything Caleb had hoped for, tears and laughter, and the fierce grip of a mother who thought she might never hold her daughter again. That night, they gathered around the kitchen table. Nora and Poppy, Catherine still getting used to freedom, Tom and Jack and Eli, Morrison having ridden out to celebrate, even old Judge Morrison still present to enjoy the victory. The table was crowded, noisy, full of life and voices overlapping in a way the ranch house hadn't experienced in over a decade. Caleb stood at the edge of the kitchen, taking it all in, and felt his heart swell with something he'd thought he'd never feel again: belonging, family, home. Nora found him there, slipping her hand into his. "You all right?" "Yeah." He squeezed her fingers gently. "Better than all right. You know what you did, don't you? Saving us. Fighting for us. Opening your home and your heart after keeping them closed for so long." "I did what was right." "You did more than that." She turned to face him fully, her gray eyes serious. "You gave me and Poppy a future. You gave Catherine her voice back. You stood against a powerful man and won, not because you had to, but because you chose to. That's not just doing what's right, Caleb. That's being extraordinary." He didn't feel extraordinary. He felt like a man who'd stumbled into something good and held on desperately. But looking at her face, seeing the gratitude and affection and something deeper shining there, he let himself accept it. "You remember what you said?" he asked quietly. "Before we left for Montana, about asking you when this was all over?" "I remember. So I'm asking, what do you feel? What do you want?" Nora smiled, soft and genuine and full of promise. I want to stay. Here, with you, building something good out of all this pain and struggle. I want Poppy to grow up on this ranch, safe and loved. I want Catherine to find healing, and I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want to see if what I feel for you, what I think you feel for me, can become something lasting, something real. It already is real, Caleb said. Has been since the moment you collapsed on that road and I couldn't ride past. Then let's make it official. She reached up, touching his face the way she had by the campfire. Not right away. We both need time to heal, to be sure. But someday, when the dust settles and Crow is behind bars and we can breathe freely, ask me to marry you. And I'll say yes. It was a promise and a hope and a future all wrapped into one, and Caleb felt tears prickling his eyes for the first time in years. I'll hold you to that. I'm counting on it. They kissed there in the kitchen doorway, while behind them the celebration continued, Poppy's laughter ringing out clear and joyful, Catherine smiling for perhaps the first time in over a year, the ranch hands toasting with whiskey and terrible jokes, Morrison regaling them all with stories of courtroom victories past. The summer heat had finally broken. Rain had come that afternoon, gentle and soaking, greening up the prairie and filling the creek. The air smelled fresh, washed clean, full of possibility. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves were turning gold and the sky was impossibly blue, Caleb Hartman married Nora Wren on the porch of the ranch house where he'd first carried her unconscious body. Poppy served as flower girl, scattering petals with serious concentration. Catherine stood as Nora's witness, healthy and strong and working alongside Nora to establish a shelter for other women fleeing abuse. Tom and the boys cleaned up remarkably well in their Sunday suits. The ceremony was simple, the words traditional, but the vows they spoke carried weight earned through hardship and fear, and the decision to keep fighting even when the odds were impossible. Gideon Crow was sentenced to 12 years in territorial prison on charges of fraud, extortion, and assault. 3 more women came forward after Catherine and Nora's testimony made headlines, their combined evidence destroying any doubt about his guilt. His boarding houses were sold, the proceeds distributed to his victims. His name became synonymous with the worst kind of predator, the kind who hid behind respectability while destroying lives. But his defeat was only part of the story. The real story was in the ranch house that came back to life, in the shelter that Nora and Catherine built that saved dozens of women in the years that followed, in Poppy growing up confident and loved, her early trauma fading into memory rather than defining her future, in Tom and the boys becoming family rather than just employees, in Caleb learning that opening his heart again didn't mean betraying what he'd lost, it meant honoring it by choosing to live fully. Years later, when Poppy was grown with children of her own, she'd ask her parents to tell the story of how they met, and Caleb would start with the brutal summer heat and a woman collapsing on a dusty road. Nora would add details about fear and desperation, and a man who stopped when everyone else might have ridden past. Together they'd weave the tale of how courage and kindness and refusing to accept injustice had built something precious from the ruins of loss. But the part Caleb never said aloud, the part he held privately in his heart, was simpler than all of that. He'd been dead for 11 years, just existing, just surviving, just moving through days that felt empty of meaning. Then a desperate woman and her feverish child had needed him, and he'd discovered that the best way to heal your own broken heart was to protect someone else's. It wasn't a miracle. It was a choice, made over and over, day after day, to let love back in despite knowing it could hurt you. And the life that grew from that choice was more than he'd ever thought he deserved, but it was exactly what he needed. The summer that brought Nora Wren to his doorstep had been brutal and unforgiving, but it had also been the summer that saved them both, not from death,